speaker today is Mark Thomas, who is a member of the Central Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party and works in the workplace and trade union department of the SWP. And Mark's also written articles for the International Socialism Journal on Corbyn and Starmer and Labour. So the way the meeting's going to work is Mark's going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to have time for questions and discussion and contribution and debate from the floor. I'll go into a bit more detail about how that's going to run when we come to it, and then Mark will come back, sum up, and yeah, that's how the meeting's going to run. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Mark.
Okay, thank you. Using a mic after 3 years is a bit of a shock, but let's see how we cope. Can everyone hear? Let's just make sure. I suspect that people might stream into this meeting, so do close up the middle spaces if more people come in. Well, look, if there was any doubt, and it's hard to believe that there is, about the sheer scale of shift to the right in the Labour Party since 2019, let's start with, amongst many, 3 pieces of evidence. First of all, Starmer's instruction last week to his shadow cabinet that they, whatever they did, they should stay as far away as possible from the picket lines of rail workers. You've heard David Lammy saying, this is not what a serious party of government does. In fact, a serious party of government doesn't even support above-inflation pay rises. It's hard to imagine Corbyn as leader staying away from a rail workers' picket line. Secondly, back in April, Starmer's successful threat to 11 Labour MPs, just 11, who signed a Stop the War statement that condemned rightly the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also condemned NATO's expansion and warned against NATO escalation. They were told, take your name off, or you'll lose the Labour whip and be suspended. They took their names off. Again, really sending a signal that in the Labour Party in 2022, even to discuss criticism of NATO is taboo. This is all the more remarkable in many ways. If you remember back in 2002, 2003, Jeremy Corbyn appeared on innumerable Stop the War platforms, criticising not Labour in opposition, but a Labour government conducting a war in Iraq, and to my knowledge, faced no disciplinary action whatsoever for that. Huge, huge shift. And thirdly, and of course this is the reason why the threat of suspension from the parliamentary party had teeth to those Labour MPs, is that Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party from 2015 to 2019, a Labour MP since 1983, etc., is currently still suspended as a Labour MP and has been so since, I had to check this, November 2020. That's nearly 20 months. And it's really just an open question at which point the Labour Party will choose a different candidate to stand for the Labour Party in his seat in Islington North. Comrades, this, amongst other things, is what defeat looks like. I say that because I think the first responsibility on the left is to face up honestly to that defeat, to face it squarely, to put an end to any kind of self-consoling illusions. Sometimes you hear, I certainly heard it around some Momentum supporters at Labour Party conference at the World Transformed Fringe last September. You know, we're still strong, the left is still strong. It hasn't reversed all of the gains of the Corbyn era. We can sometimes get emotion passed at conference. This is, I'm afraid, a delusion. You can pass all the motions you like, and not many will have passed by the left. The leadership will just ignore them. There's a war against the left. Inside the Labour Party, the left is losing. The first thing, therefore, is to honestly face the scale of defeat. What then follows, and this is true of all defeats that face the left, you have to face it, you have to analyse why, and then you have to be bold and brave enough to draw real conclusions from that analysis. And that's what I'm going to try and do. In many ways, you could understand and think about the 4 years of Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party as a giant experiment, or almost a laboratory test of a very old argument that's been there since at least the early 20th century. The Labour Party's always had socialists in it, but can it be turned into a socialist party? It was a giant test of that, and under potentially quite favourable conditions. I mean, in Corbyn, we could probably have a debate about it, the most left-wing leader Labour's had since at least the early 30s and George Lansbury. We can debate that. And with the huge influx of people into the Labour Party, excited, energised, enthused by Corbyn, it was quite clear that a majority of the Labour Party backed Corbyn. Mass of the membership backed Corbyn. And yet, that experiment failed. Now, I want to deal with one argument that locates the source of the defeat, not so much in the Labour Party, but in British society. The argument that says, at the end of the day, the problem with Corbyn is he was too left-wing for the majority of people. He moved Labour to the margins of where popular opinion lies. This is, of course, the argument, it's the ideological battering ram of Tony Blair and his acolytes. More broadly, of the Labour right that opposed Corbyn. It's also really the argument, I think, in one way or another, a layer of people who were initially enthused by Corbyn came to accept, after that shattering defeat to the general election in 2019, Corbyn was really unelectable. And that was one of the temptations of supporting Starmer, who was still putting on a bit more of a left face and so on, but somehow that he had the magic ingredient of being more electable, more media, acceptable to media and so on. So this is a real argument. It's a real argument. I want to touch on that. I mean, there's an article in The Guardian a few days ago when Starmer is boasting, after the actually rather modest victory in Wakefield by-election, that Labour was now back in the centre ground of British politics. Let's be clear that on a whole series of questions, what polling reveals, I don't mean one poll, I mean poll after poll, year after year, really for the last 30 decades, on a whole series of questions, huge swathes of the British public, and working class people in particular, are way to the left of the kind of neoliberal consensus, the centre ground and so on. A couple of bits of evidence. The British Social Attitudes Survey, 64% agree with the statement, ordinary people do not get their fair share of the nation's wealth. Take nationalisation of rail, the post office, also Royal Mail, the energy companies, it's probably gone up, water companies. Support for renationalisation of all of those hovers between 60 and 70%. I mean, it's not just one poll I'm plucking, it's stable over decades, right? Of course, on some other questions, more reactionary arguments get some traction. The point is, there isn't some stable entity called the centre ground. There's contradictory ideas that are contested and in flux. And when given a strong lead from the left, huge support can be delivered. And what people actually want above all is change. Which direction it goes in is open to political contest. There's a second piece of evidence, which I think is very powerful. To argue that Corbyn was unelectable requires a deliberate act of historical amnesia. And not about some dim, distant event in the early 20th century, about the other election that took place in 20... It's not so long ago, is it? 5 years. If you listen to the Labour right, it sort of disappears. They can't talk about it. They can't talk about it because we all know that in 2017, the Corbyn surge, for that radical programme, for an insurgent campaign, when Corbyn was at its boldest and most radical, the supposedly unelectable Corbyn saw the biggest swing in the popular vote since the Second World War, 9.5%. That translates into an extra 3.5 million people voting Labour, switching to Labour. He got more votes than Miliband in 2015.
Hello, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you. He got more votes, actually, than 3 of the 4 new Labour elections. 2010, 2005 and 2001. With the single exception of the 1997 election of Blair, which personally I think was more because people hated the Tories than anything about Blair, you have to go back to Harold Wilson in 1966 to find a bigger Labour vote. Actually, if you want to know what the real truth is, the real truth is not that the Labour right and Blair and so on thought that Corbyn was unelectable. Actually, for many of them, they feared he was all too electable. And they set out, when they said he was unelectable, what they meant was, we're going to make sure he doesn't get elected. That's the absolute truth of what took place. In other words, to begin to understand the defeat, you have to locate it within the war inside the Labour Party itself. That's the terrain that proved decisive. Yes, Corbyn had the mass of members with him, and if Labour was, as it claims, they sometimes like to finger wag at those of us who are more in the Leninist tradition, we're democratic socialists. If it was a democratic party, that would be the end of the matter. Corbyn would have stayed on top because the majority of members with him. But in a party whose fundamental orientation is parliamentary, it means one small constituency in the party, the Labour MPs, the Parliamentary Labour Party, had a disproportionate impact. Now, as everybody knows, Corbyn's base inside the Parliamentary Party was weak. When he stood in 2015 for that leadership election that we all remember, only 36 Labour MPs backed him, and the majority did so precisely on the basis they thought he had no chance of winning. He had a weak base inside the Parliamentary Labour Party, and his leadership from day one faced attacks from the Labour right, from the Parliamentary Labour Party. It faced pressures to retreat. It faced attempts to undermine him. And if you look at the first 2 years of Corbyn's leadership, I think the strategy, the response, combined two elements. First of all, a mobilisation of his base. When the Labour right attempted to unseat him, the coup of the summer of 2016, we saw a huge wave of organising, of mass rallies, outdoor rallies and so on. A really insurgent movement. And again, above all, in that 2017 general election, where enthusiasm, hope and so on, again, translated itself, took a little bit of time, but started to build up again to huge rallies and mobilisations of supporters. We had mobilisation. But it was always combined, from the beginning, also with concessions, with appeasement of the Labour right, of retreats. The decision by Corbyn and people around him, a long-time opponent of NATO, to say Labour will not oppose NATO. The decision that Labour wouldn't whip its MPs into opposing the renewal of the Trident nuclear missile programme, which cost $100 billion, by the way. The signal that Labour wouldn't actually pursue mandatory reselection of MPs. I mean, the idea that if you're a Labour MP, every 5 years, before this general election, you should see whether the members still want you to be their candidate. This is an elementary democratic point, and would have put huge pressure on the Labour right MPs and helped to discipline them. This was not pursued. This was never pursued. What I want to suggest, though, and this is a paradox, one we can explain, is that the turning point when the mobilisations ebbed and the concessions and retreats and appeasement of the Labour right grew in scale and pace was precisely the 2017 general election. Because the attitude, I think, of those around Corbyn after that was to say, we are now a government in waiting. One more push. That created a pressure for respectability and, above all, a fear about launching an all-out war against the Labour right and risking splitting the party. The fear that that could lose the goal of forming a government. So the concessions increased, the mobilisations decreased, and the combination was fatal. The two most damaging retreats were firstly on Labour's position on Brexit. Again, to remind ourselves, in the 2017 manifesto, Labour's position was to accept, more or less in these words, accept the 2016 EU referendum result, but to campaign for a people's Brexit that involved radical social democratic transformation of British society and more equality and so on. But the pressure from the Labour right, and it has to be said, from sections of the left to gradually, inexorably shift to a position where it went in 2 years later to a general election, supporting the option of a second referendum. I think this was hugely damaging. A huge chunk of Labour's 2017 voters didn't vote Labour 2 years later. And I think that was heaviest, and this is the evidence, amongst those Labour Leave voters. Particularly in a whole swathe of seats in the Midlands and the North. Labour lost 54 seats to the Tories in that election. 52 of them were majority Leave voting areas. In seats that in the referendum on the EU had voted by 60% or more for Leave, the average Labour vote fell by 6%, and the average Tory vote rose by over 10%. Why? Because there's no question, whatever your views about Brexit, that for a layer of working class Labour supporters, the decision to go against the referendum result was felt as Labour abandonment, even a betrayal, a sense that Labour was even lining up with an overwhelmingly pro-Remain establishment. And that extraordinarily, but I think damagingly, opened a space for a millionaire, Bullingdon boy, Etonian, Boris Johnson, to pose as an opponent of privilege and the elite and the establishment. And we know it's ridiculous, but it got some traction, enough for Labour to lose the election. Why? Because Labour opened the space by moving its position. And if there's a new book by Oliver Eagleton, it's called The Starmer Project, which I recommend reading, and it goes through in somewhat almost excruciating but convincing detail, not alone, but who was the central point man driving the shift away from the acceptance of Brexit towards a second referendum, Sir Keir Starmer, of course. And I think as well, the retreat on Brexit bled into other areas. If Labour can't be trusted on the referendum, how can it be trusted to implement and fight for all these other reforms it's promising, however welcome they are? I think it was deeply undermining. Second area, the question of anti-Semitism. Now we know that Corbyn faced an extraordinary, relentless barrage for 4 years that pushed the bogus claim that Labour under Corbyn had opened the door to a tsunami of anti-Semitism, entirely at odds with the reality of the very small number of cases of anti-Semitism in the party, that Labour was somehow a cold house for Jews, it was institutionally anti-Semitic and so on. And as so often with the attacks, they originated in the Labour right, they're then echoed in the mass media. These claims were then jumped on by supporters of Israel and the Tories. That's often the dynamic that took place. And it was grotesque. I mean, when you saw, the Daily Mail accusing Corbyn of being, racists accusing lifelong anti-racists of being racist. I mean, it was a grotesquerie. The problem was, the response to it was not one of relentless defiance and angry refutation of these claims. What should have been said was that one anti-Semite is too many, but the scale of the problem has been dramatically overstated by political opponents. Now that's more or less what Jeremy Corbyn did say, but unfortunately after he was leader in early 2020, and that's what he was suspended for by Starmer. It'd be so much better if he said it was when he was the leader of the party. That's right. And secondly, it should have been combined with another argument, which is that it is entirely legitimate to criticise Israel. And not just to criticise Israel, but to point out that Israel is a racist project that rests on the violent and continuing dispossession of Palestinian people. To say that, though, would have meant war with the Labour right. And again, that's what we're shied away from. So the September 2018, the acceptance of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's very flawed definition of anti-Semitism, including the statement that precisely to criticise, as they put it, Israel as a racist endeavour is inherently anti-Semitic. It pushed Labour and the Labour leadership under Corbyn onto the defensive. A trap was laid. Corbyn looked defensive. He looked untrustworthy. And this is the problem. With each retreat, from NATO through to the question of Palestine and Israel, Corbyn was now arguing things he didn't believe in. And I think one consequence of that, who argues things they don't really believe in? Politicians. What was so attractive about Corbyn to millions of people? He felt authentic. He didn't feel like a careerist. Gradually that was lost. Gradually that. You've got a whiff of that with Mick Lynch, haven't you? See how popular that kind of idea is. It had a huge impact. Now, I want to be very clear here, because it's not about saying, if only it hadn't been Brexit, if only these policies had changed, if only Jeremy had been a bit tougher, if only they'd been more ruthless, if only John McDonnell hadn't whispered, and so on and so forth. This isn't. What we have to grapple is not so much the retreats themselves, but what drove them. What drove them? Because it has deeper roots in the very nature of the Labour left project. Because the Labour left does share something with the Labour right, which is an assumption, and it's the dominant assumption of liberal democratic parliamentary regimes, that political power resides in the parliamentary chamber and in the ministries of the state. the Treasury and the Foreign Office and so on and so forth. And that therefore the goal is to get access to forming a government. It means winning elections. That electoralism is at the very centre of Labour's project. And that's why the left fears a split. Because it fears that split parties, a breakaway. The fears of Change UK, which turned out to be a bit of a damn squib. The fears that the Labour right would break, and the victory would prove elusive, and with it the tools to improve the lives of ordinary people. Therefore, unity. But the price of unity was appeasement, was retreat, and that had huge and damaging political costs. But here's the problem. The Labour right don't completely mirror that. Ultimately, the Labour right are more loyal to British capitalism than they are to the Labour Party. People may have heard, a phrase that Lenin sometimes used about in an imperialist war, revolutionary defeatism. We want the defeat to go inside. Well, the Labour right practiced in the internal war in the Labour Party, what could you call it, reactionary defeatism. Better to lose an election to drive out the left than to win an election. And clearly that's a policy that many of them pursued. That's how you can explain how, even though they're a minority, they could constantly blackmail and ultimately to defeat the right. This isn't just what happened with Corbyn. I don't have time to go into it. This is what happened to the left in the 1930s in Labour, the movement around Nye Bevan in the 50s, the movement around Tony Benn in the 1980s. This is the Achilles heel of the Labour left, that its shared commitment with Labourism, the whole idea that the key for Labour is getting elected and taking control of parliamentary institutions as a vehicle for change, is its fatal flaw. How long do I have?
10 minutes.
Okay. I just want to say something else, which I think is much more rarely talked about, but should be talked about, which is I think that because the Labour Party, including the left, essentially looks to taking control of the British state as the key to social change, it accepts the state, the British state. That has, I think, a huge electoral consequences in the minute in Scotland. It explains that commitment to Labourism, explains the left's disastrous position, in my view, on Scotland. In the 2014 independence referendum, the fact that Labour, to save the Union, actually campaigned with the Tories, was toxic in Scotland. Explain what I mean. From 1964 to 2010, the Labour Party won a majority of MPs in Scotland at every single general election. In 2015, the year after the referendum, in 2010, the last one before the referendum, 41 MPs came, Labour MPs in Scotland. 2015, 1. 2017, the Corbyn surge, 7. 2019, back to 1. Even on an electoralist arithmetic, if you want to get, what it is, the 326 MPs to form a government, the fact that you're essentially uncompetitive in 40, 50 seats in Scotland means you've got to find a hell of a lot more elsewhere. No one even talks about this. The 2017 manifesto, for all its radicalism, I checked it this morning, there's a little section for Scotland. We are opposed to a second referendum, it's unwanted. Unfortunately, it is wanted by quite large numbers of people because they didn't vote Labour. You can speculate. I think if Corbyn had gone into 2017 with that radical programme, with that sense of insurgency, and backing Scottish independence, it's at least arguable that Corbyn would have been in number 10. Now, that didn't happen, of course. If you like, the Italian revolutionary Antonio Gramsci sort of describes the state as a series of trenches, guarding the central state, the central kind of citadel of the state. If you like, to defeat Corbyn, the ruling class only needed some of those outer trenches, the Labour right and the mass media. Of course, if it got into government, other weapons could have been deployed. Economic strikes, senior civil servants, senior judges who suddenly rejected Labour's laws and so on. And if Labour supporters hadn't accepted it, and there'd been a revolt in society, of course, there's always more coercive forms of the state, military and so on. None of that was required. Corbyn was defeated inside the Labour Party. Now, Where does that leave us? Because maybe this is not particularly controversial to many people in this room. Huge numbers of people have left the Labour Party. The question that comes up again and again is, what's the alternative? As well as Marxism being a physical event again, lots of trade union conferences have started meeting again, which means you get an opportunity to listen and talk to people. I was at the Bakers Union conference, which disaffiliated from Labour recently. But the question that came up again and again when they started talking about Starmer's limitations, the need for struggle over the cost, what's the alternative? Often expressed as, who are we going to vote for now? Again, that idea that voting is the key to change in society. Now, for sure, a new electoral left challenge to Labour would be very welcome. But it needs social weight. It needs social weight to have an impact, especially in a first-past-the-post system. That can either come from a new wave of working class struggle, or Labour MPs, figures on the left, trade unions that are affiliated, breaking from Labour, preferably from both. Yeah, that's fine. Corbyn should break from Labour. He certainly should stand as an independent, but more than that, he shouldn't just stand, he should break from Labour. I have to say I'm sceptical after 20 months that that's going to happen, but he should do it. That would create a huge new enthusiasm and so on. However, I don't think we can leave it there. I think we have to go much further. We have to challenge some of the precisely the underlying assumptions of Labourism. And that key assumption is that our power, our ability to defend working class people, to challenge racism, to fight for stopping climate, etc., somehow is really in, sure, protest here, demonstration there, picket line, but really it's about Parliament. That is the fallacy that we have to break through. All of the great gains, reforms, if you like, that have benefited working class people in British history, let alone international history, trade union rights, the vote for women, the biggest gains in defending and expanding our living standards have come from collective working class struggles and mass movements. In one of the biggest gains of working class living standards and wages came in the early 70s, 1970 to 1972, when a militant working class movement, when there was a Tory government in, drove up living standards. The ensuing Labour government in the late 70s presided over the first cut to living standards since the Second World War. Now, when the miners smashed the Tory government in 1972, I think I was 4 years old. Right? So maybe that's not most convincing to people. It's a long time ago. But come on. Didn't we all feel last week, on those 3 days of rail strikes, when you suddenly got a taste of the potential power of workers, how if we saw, it's not guaranteed, but if we saw a summer of rail strikes, joined by British telecom workers who haven't struck since the late 80s, by postal workers, by others, that you could see how we could both defend our living standards and transform a labour movement that's been on the defensive for 30 years. We saw a glimpse of that kind of potential. And our job isn't to organise primarily around elections. Our job is to primarily organise around fighting to develop, fighting to ensure that the potential that we glimpsed last week is turned into reality, because it's not automatic. There are all sorts of conservative forces and trade union movements and so on. It's going to be contested. We need a whole network of activists who will not compromise on questions from NATO to immigration, but who, in dialogue with others who may not always agree with everything that we say, we seek to build the confidence and combativity of the working class. That requires politics, that requires strategies, that requires organisation, and that's what the Socialist Workers' Party is trying to build.
Now we're going to hear from the floor directly. The way that's going to work is I'll call a speaker to speak, and you'll have 3 minutes to speak. I'll tap the mic when you've had 2 minutes, and then after 3 minutes, I'll tell you, I'll ask you politely to sum up. any questions, thoughts, and then Mark will come back and sum up afterwards. If you'd like to speak, just indicate and wave at me. I'll call a speaker, and then I'll also let you know who's going to be speaking afterwards, just so we can get the mic to you, which will be roaming around. Okay, so if anyone wants to indicate to speak, and then, okay, Comrade at the top there, and then we'll go Comrade with his hand there.
Hi, I'm Hans-Peter. I'm a supporter of the Bolshevik tendency. I agree with a lot of the summary of the weakness of the Labour left in fending off the attacks on Corbyn, and I agree with the fact that its roots really lie in parliamentarianism as opposed to a Leninist strategy, which aims to implement the program and go beyond the program that Jeremy Corbyn raised in 2017 and 2019. I think his Corbyn was relatively weak even compared to Tony Benn's program in the late 1970s. And the fundamental problem is twofold, I think. One problem lies with the state. So in 2015, or I can't remember whether it was 2015 or slightly later, one of the British generals announced that should Jeremy Corbyn be elected, there would be a military coup because the British capitalist class couldn't possibly allow someone as irresponsible as Jeremy Corbyn to take the helm of the state. And that's for somebody who has a relatively moderate social democratic program which appeared radical only in front of the context of mass austerity. So I think the Leninist strategy, and I know we are quite far away from that, but as the strike might point towards a hint to how it's possible, is to aid workers need to build self-defense so that the capitalist class can't resort to military coups and the like to fend off workers' movements that really want to implement the improvement of the living standards. But B, that also points, and that's the other big problem of labourism, is that the economic power base lies in the private ownership of the enterprises. And these need to be taken out of the hands of the capitalist class and run democratically under a plan under workers' control. And that is something that Corbyn couldn't and didn't want to talk about. And I think that is, so in terms of the strikes, I think strikes can potentially point to into the right direction. They need to be built towards defying the anti-union laws so that the RNT and other unions can go on strike indefinitely. They need to coordinate their strike actions to a general strike. And they need to, and workers within the unions need to create awareness of the fact that they need to build organs of self-defense, because as the miners' strike demonstrates, the state will be quite vicious in breaking these strikes.
Darren, West Wales, SWP. This is a very quick and simple question. Before I left the Labour Party, on the back of the membership card, on the first sentence, it said, "This is a socialist party." Is that still the case? Thank you very much.
My name's Sharon from Birmingham. Just want to start off saying how brilliant the rail strikes were last week, and I just love the way Mick Lynch has become a kind of media star, to be honest. You know, the way he took down Kay Burley and Piers Morgan was just brilliant. I'm watching it over and over again. But it was just, my question really is in relation to the last point that you made about, you know, if the likes of, and there's quite a few of them, isn't there? Jeremy Corbyn, Diane Abbott, Mark Savotka, Sharon Graham, Ken Loach, all of these characters, there's loads. If by some miracle, I don't think they will, they were to break away and form some kind of left alliance, and it would be a miracle, I think, if they did. What would socialist workers' view be about? Is that an alliance that socialist workers would join? That's my question. Thanks, Mum.
Can you come back?
I understand that fighting elections isn't everything, but I think it can be a focus for organisations. We've got people before profit in Ireland, and I know Bridget Smith, who's a TD, and she's regularly on the news. The Parliament is televised. She's able to put forward arguments. And if you look at Mick Lynch, the amount of people who are engaged with that guy, who are listening to him because he's just a working class bloke trying to stand up for his own people. So in that sense, do you think that electoral campaigns can be helpful to the left?
I want to make 2 points. The first is that the Starmer project is far from completed. If you look at what they are doing, it's very obvious that Starmer does not want an alliance with the Labour left. He wants an alliance with the Liberal Democrats. And it's a completely thought through strategy that the next Labour government will be in alliance with the Liberal Democrats and will rule completely overtly in the interests of capital. It will be a government that imposes the wishes of big business in the same way that Boris Johnson's does, but with a different approach, a more competence towards the bosses. That's really what Starmer is offering. It doesn't mean that Starmer is the same as the Tories, but that is what they roll out as a programme for the future. Very, very clear about the way that Starmer considers it. And therefore, the left is going to be beaten over the head again and again and again. And the reality is, every time they've run away. Every time they've run away, and by doing that, they encourage more of the attacks from Starmer. The second point is the alternatives, because you're quite right, it would be actually quite useful if we had a bigger left, if we had a left that had MPs, for example. And by the way, if we did have MPs, it would be a disciplinary offence not to go to a picket line. We have to talk about it honestly. And I hope that Jeremy Corbyn and Mark Walker and the other people that the comrade mentioned do start thinking about breaking away. But I'll tell you, the last thing we want is to think that the horizon of the left is simply to create a Labour Party Mark II. You see, would the SWP join it? Well, it depends. We probably vote for it, but whether you vote, whether you join it for it or not, depends on a whole number of things. Is it centred and disciplined by and concentrated on the question of elections, or is it concentrated on the question of struggle in the workplaces and the streets? Because there is no point investing our effort, our time, our energy, our enthusiasm in creating another electoral project which sees the central element as being in Parliament rather in the struggles of ordinary people. We need something that says that the rail workers' strike and the BLT workers' strikes and the future strikes that are coming, I hope, are the centre of politics, not just an add-on to an electoral manoeuvre. And that's the crucial break that we need to make of British politics, away from the politics of electoralism in Parliament, towards the politics of socialist struggle and of relying on struggle from the base of society.
Yeah, hard one to follow that one, I think, Charlie. Yeah, so I just want to sort of like put a plug for 2 little short bits of reading for people, just because of sort of like things that came up. In the Irish Marxist Review, in their most recent issue, there is a very good article, What is People Before Profit? Which by John Molyneux, who's like a leading member sort of over there, which does make a very good sort of like point, exactly happening what's said here. Is it isn't something that's just formed sort of like, out of your thumb kind of, and then it's something that emerged from real struggles from below that were going on in Ireland in terms of the water charges and in terms of the struggle for abortion. So that's a very good sort of piece, and that kind of emphasises really sort of, I suppose, the central point of what is the alternative to the Labour Party and sort of electoralism, which is that it does need to come from real social struggle and real class struggle. And so, if we can talk about overthrowing capitalism, obviously, we need to overthrow capitalism, we need to smash the state, replace it with a worker state, all of that stuff. But it's where are the workers that are struggling in order to, to get to that, right? And we are seeing it a little bit with the RMT, obviously, sort of, hopefully starting off sort of like in the waves of the class struggle. But I think that question, with what forces are we going to form the new party, is the central one for every socialist. And I think it is a matter of, getting into the trade unions and sort of like building within there. I have to say, it's a hard struggle and a hard slog. Sort of like we just recently in the left in unison, public sector union warrior, got our asses completely kicked, sort of, at our national conference. But and there, discussions we've had within the left, within that union, sort of about what our strategy is going forward and so on. So like, real hard conversations, but there is something real there in terms of trying to organise the membership and and bring pressure from below within the union, sort of like with and against the bureaucracies, sort of like within those. And so the other one, I'll just sort of like put another quick sort of thing in for is, sorry, I'll just finish off. Tony Cliff's book, it's out there, sort of Marxist and trade union struggle. It's part history of the 1926 general strike and part sort of like a general theoretical thing of how should Marxists operate in and around trade unions. So I just like get a copy of that book as well.
It's been a great discussion and brilliant lead on. My name is Maggie again in Glasgow, Socialist Workers' Party. I think it's highly ironic, but not surprising that the Labour Party is led by a knight of the British Empire, Sir Starmer, and also on the case of the election in 2017. To think that what's not surprising that so many Labour MPs were actually attacking Corbyn, who was democratically elected leader in the course of the election campaign, and when they stopped that, Labour's support for Labour actually went right up. They clearly didn't want to be in power with him as a leader. And another point that I wanted to make was obviously a lot of young comrades, like myself, at the festival, and I found that it links so much to the kind of work that we're doing in the Socialist Workers' Party, because I'm speaking as an English teacher who, if you're studying teaching English, then part of the things they have to do is how to write discursive essays. It's a bit handy if you're a big lefty like myself and give them a few suggestions for things to research. I'll always say to them, you disagree with me, but back it up with facts. But I've always found the young people that I've worked with to be really radical in their views, but haven't felt represented by people at the top. And I think it was quite interesting. Some of you might remember 2 or 3 years ago when Trump came to Scotland and there was the Women's March against Trump in Edinburgh. Sadly, I couldn't make it because I had a big family thing on, but the 2 young people who organised it were actually former pupils of mine, and they invited me to speak, the opening speaker, so we could introduce me as a teacher. They called them interested in radical politics. So I didn't get the sack over that kind of thing. I think that the points I make, it's not just the one that's wonderful person, it's not that at all. It's to say that there's just a whole generation out there. You see the young people, as older people, are carrying on campaigning as well. But just to finish, it just shows what's there to be organised in campaigns just now and coming up in revolutionary campaigns, and that is we want to move forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Victor from the Planet Plus Affiliated Society. You said, and I think that's really important, that the left needs to account for its failures and think about what to change. But you've told us a lot about the failures of the left Labour Party, perhaps of the Labour Party, not so much about the failures of the Socialist Workers' Party. Did the Socialist Workers' Party not make any mistake? Was this not a failure for you? Or is the Socialist Workers' Party just the Labour left? And broader than this, we're at a Marxist festival and you're a Trotskyist organization. What about the failure of Trotskyism for about 60 years? 80 years now after the, 60 years after the traditional program to actually, produce a revolutionary situation. And what about the failure of Marxism to do the same? How do we account for that? And what would be needed to change this, to produce a revolutionary movement anew. Thank you.
Yeah. And then we'll come to the front here.
Yeah, cheers. Nick Clark from. So, I mean, I guess one of the sort of the, I don't know what is it, themes, questions that sort of underline a lot of this discussion, and one of the things that you often hear from the Labour left sort of organisations and activists is, this sort of question of the relationship between what the Labour left does inside the Labour Party and movements and struggle and campaigns outside of the Labour Party. And I think what you often hear, that one of the ideas of the Labour left is that you can sort of bring the two together. You can bring together sort of movements and struggle outside of Labour with the struggle inside of the Labour Party and the goal of the left and the left wing. Get it in, say, Momentum's handbook, which describes itself as acting as a bridge between extra parliamentary struggle and the Labour Party. You hear it quite a lot at, say, the World Transform last year, when a lot of the Labour left was really trying to sort of figure out what it was doing, and you heard a lot from the platform. You heard a lot from people, say, even John McDonnell. The thing to do now is, John McDonnell, I think, spoke to the Socialist campaign group rally and said, what you've got to do is you've got to be alongside every industrial struggle, every demonstration, every social movement. But then goes on to say that the reason for this is to bolster the Labour left in its battles inside of the Labour Party. In other words, the reason for being involved in struggle outside of Labour is to help the struggle inside of Labour. In other words, the Parliament and the struggle inside of Labour comes first. And I think it sort of has two effects. I think in practice, I think really, I think it's being inside Labour is a pull away from those struggles. Just for example, on the TUC demonstration last couple of weeks ago, I didn't really see any Momentum sort of placards or banners that you used to see for a while on demonstrations. I'm not saying that there were no, obviously there must have been Labour Party members there must have been Momentum members there, but the Labour left that was not there as any sort of organised cause. I think even more, I think that eventually it sort of ends to sort of sacrificing or perhaps even betraying the movements and the struggle outside of Labour in the interest of staying in. And I think the decision of all of the Socialist campaign group MPs to sort of turn their backs on the Stop the War coalition at the very moment that was needed most, I think is sort of the epitome of that. I think it's sort of I think it's an illustration really of the sort of the total defeat of the Labour left, but also the failure of that strategy.
So we'll go to the comrade here, and then we'll go to the comrade in here.
Yeah, I think when we talk about failure, let's start with the big picture, the failures of the system. The system globally, we are hurtling into climate chaos. We have regime after regime in our own, whipping up phenomenal amount of racism and an attack on people's living standards, again globally, which is, for many people in this room, a new experience in our lifetimes. This is the start of the crisis. And whatever failures have happened, we have to address. And I don't think anyone in this room would say the FDP has been perfect and has never made a mistake. That would be foolish to say, because if you're involved in struggle, trying to build revolutionary organisation, the whole process is testing things out. You make mistakes, you do some things good, you do something better, and sometimes you make mistakes and you have to learn from them. That's about the question of the democracy inside an organisation, which can actually start to move things forward. A few weeks ago in Bristol, we had a climate summit. We had nearly 300 people, overwhelmingly young, in the room, in the hall. Jeremy Corbyn came and spoke, and he spoke brilliantly, is the honest truth, and he was very radical. And I got a minute to say 10 seconds to Jeremy Corbyn. I said, to be honest, Jeremy, I hope you don't get the whip back. You look more relaxed. You look more free to say what you really want to see. If you have the whip, you may not even be good. And he did give you a smile. But there's a discipline on Labour left MPs, which is to keep your mouth shut. It's to take your name off the statement. It's to not go to the picket line. It's to not really speak out. It's to always look to unity with the very people who want to cut your throats. And I think that's the problem we have. And part of, I think, building revisionisation is learning from the past. I'll end on this. Mick Lynch has done brilliantly on the media. There's no question about it. It's a breath of fresh air. It is. Seeing him take Kay Burley and various other clowns to the team is brilliant. But it won't win the dispute. That will not win. This dispute will not be won because who debated better on Sky News. It will be won by who mobilises the biggest amount of forces, because the Tories and this ruling class know that this dispute is very central. Because if we get a victory for the RNC and others, it'll potentially open the floodgates. They're not stupid about this. And so this will not be who's cleverer. It's who mobilises people and make damn sure we know that Mick Lynch will be under severe pressure to do a deal. He will be under phenomenal pressure in all sorts of ways not to actually escalate the action, not to further that action that we can get the victory we need. You know, we have lots of heroes on the left, but let's open our eyes at the same time.
Parliamentary democracy and how that can bring about change. But as we've seen in the last few years, that's been incredibly warped by basically special interest groups. Whilst the power of the state is immense, it's not the only source of power. There's the trade unions, there's the cooperative movement, there's other labour movements. So we need to focus more, not just on, yes, focus on getting the power of the state. That would be great if we could wield it for better outcomes for the working class, but also other sources of power, like local council elections, stuff on a small scale on a local level. Also, there needs to be a build-up of organisations and movements that can counter the mainstream narratives. So we have a massive mainstream media in the UK that's controlled, I think 80% is controlled by 6 billionaires. So that's never going to give a fair view of any left-wing politics that might endanger the status quo. So there needs to be a focus on building up independent media as well to hold those in account.
Hello, my name is Sofia Rama. I'm from Norway. I'm an air hostess by profession, but I'm on unpaid leave because of political work, and I represent the Red Party in the city council in Oslo. Okay, yes. Deputy MP in the parliament. The situation you're describing with the Labour Party is similar to the Labour Party in Norway as well, because after 20 years, well, more than 20, sorry, maybe 30 years of adopting liberal policies, working class voters have abandoned the Labour Party. And we had 8 years of a conservative government, which messed up things even more. But the far left is growing in Norway, and that's something that's a bit new. We have two parties left of Labour, which is the Socialist left and the Red Party. After the last election last year, the Red Party for the first time ever gained 8 MPs in the parliament. So that's a success, but a downside is that the Red Party probably maybe will move to the right, and that's a struggle we have as well. I mean, the more power you gain, that's kind of a natural result of gaining power. So that's something we struggle with in our party. And the Socialist left, they have even changed their stance on NATO because of the war against Ukraine. And that's a huge problem for the radical left as well. And there was a slight decrease in the popularity after the war, but considering that the working class is struggling more and more, that was just a slight decrease. And okay, well, that was just an analysis from Norway that the left is growing and the Labour Party is unfortunately, well, unfortunately for them, but good for us. they're struggling a bit, but they have to be in government in order for us to gain more power as well.
So I'm going to hand back to Mark now to wrap up the discussion. So yeah, over to Mark.
Yeah, okay. Firstly, let me just take up the comrade's question about is Labour still claiming to be a socialist party? I don't know what's on the latest membership cards. I'm not sure I particularly care. But what occurred to me is, I mean, Labour has described itself as socialist since about 1918, when it opened up to be a mass membership organisation. Because it's always needed to attract activists. Someone has to go out and deliver all those leaflets and the knocker and so on. But there's a brilliant analysis from a man long forgotten now. He used to be a very important social democratic theorist, Tony Crossland. I think you'll find a description of it in the Tony Cliff Gluckstein book, where he said, you know, the way the Labour Party is set up is that it needs activists. And it needs those activists to think their ideas matter, that they get a say. And often those activists have, you know, left-wing ideas. So you get that it's a socialist, it's a democratic socialist, the conference is sovereign, but simultaneously it's organised through sometimes the power of the trade union leaders, but particularly through the Parliamentary Labour Party, which ever since 1907, when they first got 29 MPs, declared itself independent of the rest of the party. This isn't new, by the way, that it robs the activists of any real power. In other words, it's never been a democratic party, and therefore it's not a socialist party, but it has socialists in it, and that contradiction is always there. Starmer's project, that Charlie Kimber was talking about, he comes on after the biggest left-wing wave inside the Labour Party in generations. When he talks about responsible government, it's a phrase he uses all the time. What's he really saying? It's actually directed at the ruling class. What it's saying is, we accept our responsibility to make sure that the Labour Party is no threat whatsoever to the wealth, power and interests of the ruling class. Therefore, you can call off the attack dogs in the media and let us into office. That's really his strategy. The ruling class isn't stupid, you know, corrupt and also not good, some of them are. But they're not totally stupid. They don't just want to say so. They don't just say, well, you, Mr. Keir Starmer, and again, anyone that reads Oliver Eagleton's book, especially in his period as the Director of Public Prosecutions, you know, he's got this image of being a human rights lawyer. Sure, there's some of that. The collaboration, not just with the state, with the security state, including the American security state, is extensive. He's always been a pro-state individual, no threat at all. But they say, you might be right, but what about the rest of them? How do we guarantee there won't be another Corbyn, another way? And therefore, his project is the war on the left. To prove in practice, to walk the walk, to show that Labour is not a threat to ruling class interests. Occasionally, he remembers he's supposed to criticise the Tories too, which he's not particularly good at. That's his project that's taking place at the moment, a war on the activists, if you like. What about the prospects of a new party? Again, it's a thought experiment, isn't it? What if, you know, Unite disaffiliated from Labour? What if Jeremy Corbyn broke, etc., etc., etc.? Would we join it? Well, first of all, the Socialist Workers' Party is a democratic organisation, and if one central committee member here simply declared we'd have a debate about it, serious debate. Charlie's right. Questionably, you'd vote for it. But how you relate to it is open to debate and discussion. The key thing is it orientated on struggle, or is it orientated on elections? And by the way, there's a particular problem in Britain, isn't there? That getting MPs, I'm looking at one or two people who spent a long time campaigning, it's not easy. It's not easy because of first past the post. You can actually there are parties that have got millions of votes and ended up with one MP, right? Now, if you're orientated on struggle, 1 or 2 MPs is fantastic. If they're serious about that struggle, because they can act as a beacon for it. There was someone else that was in favour of having socialist and deep revolutionary MPs, Lenin. The Bolsheviks had representatives in the very undemocratic Duma. They were often it's an illegal party in Tsarism. They were the legal. Where did you send your strike collection to help the struggle? You sent it to the MP because they were very, very useful. The problem is, when people break from Labour, and millions of people, well, hundreds of thousands of activists are breaking from Labour, and you think, I want an alternative, I want to sweep Labour aside, 1 or 2 MPs is a good start, but then it's very disappointing. because you want hundreds, because you want to be the government, because that's your orientation. And it tends to destabilise any new initiative. So there has been an argument around any new initiative about it being orientated on struggle. We have to push the argument further. And, you know, at the heart of that argument is an argument that persuaded me in 1989 to join the Socialist Workers' Party. Because it's not just that the power of the state, the power of the ruling class, means that parliamentary institutions, if you had 400 Jeremy Corbyns elected to Parliament and they all voted for massive tax rises on the rich, and, you know, the ruling class wouldn't say, well, Queensberry rules, fair play, we don't agree, but you've won an election, you know, I'll get my checkbook out. There'd be massive resistance to it. That's the first thing. The second thing is important as well. And this is a slight overstatement. Of course, elections can infuse people, they see a sense of the left and so on. But I'll tell you what the problem with elections and the ballot box is it takes 2 minutes, and this is a cue. It doesn't transform you. You emerge as the same person. Even over the 3 days of the rail strike, going down to the same picket line, you start to see the impact on people. People who initially thought they're nervous about the public support, discovering for every one person that had a go, 100 supported them. You can imagine what a summer of strikes, militant strikes, you know, mass strike movements, revolutions change us. That's what really burns away all the reactionary ideas of capitalist society, and above all, the sense of powerlessness that working class people. That's why we have to be orientated on struggle. Now, Comrade asked about a big question, the failure of Marxism, you know, why hasn't the Trotskyist left broken through? And actually, these are the things we want to discuss, big questions about the future of Marxism. But let me just say this, because it's a debate that can be pursued over the weekend. Since the late 1920s, the organised workers' movement, certainly in Europe, has been dominated, on the one hand, by Stalinism, the Communist parties, a lot of the best militants joined, never the mass party in Britain, but the best people joined it quite often, and social democracy, the Labour Party, which at points appeared to be able to deliver reforms through being in government in 1945 and so on. Those conditions have been transformed. The collapse of the Soviet Union, although it's now so long ago that some people are rather nostalgic for Stalinism, there's arguments there, but it doesn't have the base it did. And that era of my parents' generation, of the mass boom, the mass full unemployment, the welfare state, that sense, you might be right, comrade, about revolution, but my life's getting better and I hope my children's life will get, through reform, through electing. That's in the distant past. That's in the distant past. Secondly, as Hugh said, we live in an era of deep political, economic, political and ecological crises that are going to open up huge dangers, because you have the far right and the fascists seeking to challenge that anger, but also huge opportunities for more struggle. Just read what's happening in Sudan today. Read what's happening in Sri Lanka. We're going to see more explosions, mass struggles, and some of them will begin to push through into revolutionary challenges. That matters, therefore, whether the revolutionary left is organised. I'd also say that after the great Stop the War movement in the early 2000s, I think the fact that we didn't see a big surge of worker struggles meant a generation of people started to look elsewhere from the revolutionary left. People started to identify with the excitement of Syriza, the radical left party, and said, we need a Syriza here. And eventually they thought they discovered it in Corbyn's left. In other words, the pull of left reformist ideas took a hold. A decade on, we have to draw a balance sheet. Syriza was smashed actually by the European Union, who blackmailed the left reformist government. It wasn't that it had an inadequate programme, it always had a better programme. The problem is they couldn't implement their programme because they discovered they had no power. Sitting in red ministries doesn't give you power over the state, over the economy. And secondly, we have the defeat of the Corbyn project. And therefore, I think we are on the cusp of huge crises, huge radicalisation, a race between the radical left and the radical right. The one place that is toxic is the liberal centre. There's a huge desire for change. Tragically, that Johnson was able to channel more of that than Corbyn in some ways in 2019. We can never allow this to happen. We need a complete break, not just from the Labour Party, but from an orientation on an institution that is a trap, which is a parliamentary government. Our power does not lie in Parliament. Our power lies on the picket line, on organising and so on. And here, the point is very true about the rail strike. Look, I'm all in favour, for example, of coordinating strikes. I'm all in favour of it. We need that. But I'll tell you what I'm not in favour of, waiting to coordinate strikes. I fear that's what the RMT is going to do. It's going to wait for us left, it's going to and delay strikes. That's an argument. You go to a picket line, not everyone will accept that. You have to put those arguments. You have to take up the same Mick Lynch, who was brilliant against Kay Burney, presided over, I think, one of the most significant defeats that we have faced, which is that the P&O ferries, people were sacked and there was next to no resistance. It's contradictory, it's not one of it, it's both. So trade unions can push a struggle forward at one point and then act as a brake to do a deal. That means you need an independent network of activists in the RMT. That means you need, it's not illegal to have indefinite strikes. Tell you what, you need a wave of solidarity. There's no strike pay. You need a sense that a movement can support those kind of, that's a responsibility of all of us, and above all, a responsibility in each and every workplace to be arguing for more action. That is more effective if you're not just an individual, but you're collectively organised in a party that isn't indifferent to elections, but says the key thing, the key test for all of us each day is what we're doing to build the confidence of working class people to fight back.